I'd like to turn now for a few minutes to Part 4 of Bill C-63, the amendments to the Federal-Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act. These amendments empower the Minister of Finance to enter into cannabis taxation agreements with provincial governments. This is a government that came to power promising to listen to Canadians and dedicate itself to evidence-based policy. But in its rush to meet a self-imposed deadline for legalization of cannabis, the government is showing it is not listening and is ignoring the evidence. In September, the provincial justice ministers asked the federal government to slow down on its legalization plans. Police across this country have asked that implementation be delayed. They need time to train officers and to certify drug recognition experts to deal with cannabis-impaired drivers, pilots, truck drivers, and anybody who works in heavy machinery. They have repeatedly said it is impossible to be ready by July 1st, 2018. There are only 600 officers certified as drug recognition experts in Canada, but the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police say at least 2,000 are needed. Rick Barnum, Deputy Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police, says if the government does not postpone the legalization date, there will be no window following July 1st of 6 months to a year when police will not be ready. To quote Deputy Commissioner Barnum, the damage that can be done between the time of new legislation and police officers being ready to enforce the law in 6 months or a year can make it very hard for us to ever regain that foothold, close quotes. They won't be ready to keep our streets and highways safe. They won't be ready to prevent organized crime from exploiting the grow-at-home exemptions. They simply will not be ready to enforce this law. And it's not just police who want a delay. The provinces of Quebec and Manitoba have made the same request. And the public, although it supports legalization, has grave concerns about the timelines. This is a major policy shift that raises important health and safety concerns. Proper regulation has been subject to appropriate consultation is critical. Yet in the government's haste, it has decided to bypass normal regulatory process. Proposed regulations are generally published in Part 1 of the Canada Gazette. Typically, the text of the regulation is published along with a regulatory impact assessment statement, a note on the number of days open for comment, and contact information to provide feedback. It is called pre-publication. After public consultation, the regulations as enacted are published in Part 2 of the Canada Gazette. It is part of an open and transparent regulatory process that is one of the best in the world. But in the case of the federal cannabis regulations, the Health Canada document entitled Proposed Approach to the Regulation of Cannabis, released 2 weeks ago, said the following, and I quote, "To meet the government's commitment of bringing the proposed Cannabis Act into force no later than July 18, the final regulations will need to be published in the Canada Gazette Part 2 as soon as possible following royal assent. As such, it is important that interested parties provide feedback on the regulatory proposals in this consultation paper, as the draft regulations will not be pre-published," end quote. There is a mechanism available under the Treasury Board guidelines to exempt regulations from pre-publication. Exemptions from the normal process are permissible when regulations are of minimal impact or correct errors to ensure consistency between official languages, or when they respond to emergencies, or when they are a sense of nature when pre-publication would cause adverse effects, such as when changing subsidies or interest rates. But there is no scenario imaginable in which cannabis regulations would qualify for one of these exemptions. For one of the most important policy shifts in many years in this country, one with profound implications for public health and safety, the government is short-circuiting the regulatory process. There is no reason for this undue haste, aside from the fact they want revenue from taxation, which brings us back to Bill C-63 and a federal cannabis tax framework with the provinces. We have heard the Prime Minister's views on this, that the federal government should get half of the excise tax to be imposed on the retail sale of cannabis. This despite the cost despite the fact that the costs in enforcing the new law and the consequences that flow from increased use of cannabis will be overwhelmingly borne by provinces and municipalities. I hope there is substance to recent reports that suggest the government is willing to grant a larger share to the provinces, provided the money is shared with municipal governments. That is an encouraging sign, because there is no doubt the legalization of cannabis will put a severe strain on local governments. But the lack of agreement on tax-sharing revenues is the least of the problems with the government's approach to this issue.